This video is about the immune system and immune cells. This diagram looks massively complicated, so I made a simplified version as well, which I'll probably go through first. So these are all of our different immune cells. At the start, we've got our pluripotent hematopoietic cells. I'll expand on that a bit further, but that's basically where everything stems from. Then this goes into your two main categories, which is your myeloid stem cells, or you've got your lymphoid stem cells. Myeloid is talking more about like bone marrow. Then lymphoid is talking more about like lymphatic system. Our myeloid stem cells then have three different like subcategories kind of thing. You've got our megakaryocytes, reticulocytes, and we've got our myeloblasts. Myeloblasts is where the majority of like our immune cells come from. And then if we look towards the other side, we've got our lymphoid stem cells, and that forms our B lymphocytes, our T lymphocytes, and natural killer cells or NK cells. B lymphocytes will form our plasma cells, which will produce antibodies, and our memory cells, which produces, or like they produce their memory cells, so it'll help for like future infection and a speedy secondary immune response. Then we got T lymphocytes, and that forms our CD4 cells, which of course have CD4 receptors on their cell surface membrane. And then we've got CD8 cells, which similarly would have CD8 um, receptors on their membrane. And CD4 cells will form our T helper cells. Now, these help with activation of like general immune cells. And our CD8 cells which will form cytotoxic T cells. Now, this kills like pathogens and everything via two forms, either via cell lysis or by apoptosis, I believe. I'll expand a bit more about that. Now, if you go back to the middle, like I said, there's two main subcategories, which is our myeloid stem cells, lymphoid stem cells. However, a third main category is our dendritic cells. Now, dendritic cells, I didn't know where to write them because these can arise from both our myeloid and our lymphoid lineages, so these pathways. So dendritic cells don't really have a category, I guess. They can arise from different ways. That's a really quick overview in like 2 minutes. Now let's go into the more complicated version, which I will kind of break down. So if we start right from the top, we've got, like I mentioned, our pluripotent hematopoietic stem cells. Pluri means multiple, potent means potential, hemato, blood, poietic, creative, and stem cells. If you read it all together, it makes sense because our multiple potential in the blood, creative, and differentiated cells. This is basically where everything stems from. Now, these are stimulated by differentiation inducers, which of course would cause differentiation. Now, firstly, before I go into this, let's first talk about cytokines because I'm gonna reference back to that in a few times. So cytokines, these are small proteins that act as a chemical messengers in the body, and they regulate immune response and inflammation. So let's look at this now back towards pluripotent stem cells. One of the pathways is our myeloid stem cells. Now we're talking more about like bone marrow and everything. Like I mentioned before, there's three main subcategories kind of thing. We've got our megakaryocytes. Mega means large, karyo means nucleus, cyte means cell. So these are like our large nucleus cells, and this will help us form our platelets. Of course, platelets is involved with blood clotting, and that whole lecture with clotting and all that clotting cascade. Then we've got back to myeloid stem cells. The second category will be our reticulocytes. Reticulum, you think like a net-like. Cyte means cells. So these basically are net-like cells, and they're basically immature red blood cells. And when this net-like reticulum they have, when they lose it, they will form our red blood cells. So that's the pathway. We've got our myeloid stem cells forming our reticulocytes, which then form our red blood cells. And reticulocytes, they have extra information. They're like approximately 1% of in the blood. Now let's go back to our main category. So our myeloid stem cells then form, or can also form, our myeloblasts. Myelo means like your bone marrow. Blast means immature cells. That's also very important to know for reproduction, I think, when you have like fertilization and how the cell forms. Yep. So myeloblasts. Now these formed are main categories of immune cells. We've got our neutrophils, monocytes, eosinophils, macrophages, which form our monocytes, and we've got our mast cells and our basophils. So I'll first start with our most important one, I think, which is our monocytes. So wrong thing. Monocytes. So mono means single. So mono means single, and this is referring to our single nucleus cell. Now you can see there's one nucleus. Now, just something to note, monocytes, they circulate the bloodstreams. So when they enter the tissues, then they become macrophages. So macrophages, they wait in the tissues, and as we all know, they're the first line of defense. Macro means big, phage means to eat. And then, yeah, these macrophages, they have got TLRs. TLR means toll-like receptors. So that's basically these like receptors on their cell surface membrane. And these will help us to recognize molecules which are unique to pathogens. So each pathogen has a unique molecule to itself, also known as a PAMP. PAMPs means pathogen-associated molecules or patterns. And basically, once this whole thing happens, that will help us lead to phagocytosis, which is when the pathogen is engulfed and broken down. Now, that's one of our main things. Let's go into a different pathway. So let's now go from our myeloblasts into maybe our eosinophils. Eosin is talking about the fact that it's red colored. So um, this cell has got cytoplasmic granules, which takes dye really well. And if I think it shows like red under a microscope, that's just like background information as to why they're called that. So eosinophils, these are important when the pathogen is too large for phagocytosis. For example, we've got a parasitic infection, and these basically just wait in the tissues until they're activated by like your cytokines. Remember, cytokine is like a chemical messenger that can be used to regulate the immune response and inflammation. So eosinophils have to be activated by either the cytokine or the pathogen, and these granules contain they contain both pro-inflammatory cytokines as well as toxic chemicals. And eosinophils can also perform phagocytosis. However, it's of a lesser extent than like our macrophages. So that's another category. Now let's go back to the beginning. Myeloblasts, we can also form a neutrophil from this. Neutral, of course, means neutral. Phils means attraction. So basically, neutrophils are like a general attack cell. These circulate the bloodstreams, and when there's like inflammation happening, these would then migrate to the site of inflammation, and they would destroy the pathogen by phagocytosis. So these cells are basically just looking for something to happen. They're looking for drama. The second they see something, they just run towards it, and then they would destroy the pathogen by phagocytosis. Now, last category, or like last two, we've got our myeloblasts, which then lead into our mast cells and our basophils. I've linked these together because they're similar types of cells. They both contain cytoplasmic granules, and they both release cytokines. However, the main difference is that mast cells are fixed in place in tissues, whereas basophils circulate around the blood. The reason I made this video, even though this is very like generic and basic, is so this is just like a skeleton for us to expand on later. Now that's basically the first category. So we had, if I summarize quickly, pluripotent hematopoietic stem cells forming our myeloid stem cells, which have three categories: megakaryocytes, reticulocytes, and myeloblasts. Megakaryocytes forms our platelets, reticulocytes forms our red blood cells, and then our myeloblasts forms the majority of like the cells you associate with the immune system. Monocytes, which then forms our macrophages when they enter the tissues, or when monocytes enter the tissues, then they form macrophages. Then we have eosinophils, which are mainly involved in like pathogens that are too large for phagocytosis. Neutrophils, which are basically looking for drama, migrate to the site of inflammation and destroy pathogen by phagocytosis. Then we've got our mast cells, which basically the same thing, but one is fixed in place in the tissue, one circulates around the blood, and they both release cytokines. Now let's go to our second path. So back to the start, we have our pluripotent hematopoietic stem cells. This can also differentiate into our lymphoid stem cells. Now, of course, we're talking about the lymphatic system here. From the lymphoid stem cells, there's three categories. We've got either our B lymphocytes, which can form, our T lymphocytes, or our natural killer cells, also known as NK cells. So let's first talk about B lymphocytes. B lymphocytes, they mature in the B for bone marrow. B lymphocytes have antibodies on the surface, and these are specific to a specific antigen. So once the B lymphocytes is activated by a specific antigen, it will then multiply rapidly to form either your plasma cells or your memory cells. Plasma cells, of course, they produce antibodies against antigens, and then memory cells would await future infections. I think we were talked about this in A level. Now let's talk about our T lymphocytes. So our T lymphocytes, these leave the bone marrow as they leave bone marrow called thymocytes, and then I don't know if that's a bit of like unnecessary information maybe. So then T lymphocytes' main thing is that they mature in the T for thymus gland into your T cells. So These T lymphocytes have got T cell receptors, and same concept as B lymphocytes, it's specific to a specific antigen. Now, T lymphocytes can form two types. You've got either your CD4 cells or your CD8 cells. CD4 cells, they have got our, I spelled that like really, I don't know, it's hard to read, but it's basically got our CD4 receptors, whereas CD8 cells have got our CD8 receptors. Now, the CD4 cells, these respond to our MHC class 2 receptors, and these can be found on like other cells in the body. Similarly, the CD8 cells respond to MHC class 1 receptors. Now, important thing to bear in mind here is the rule of 8. 4 times by 2 is 8, whereas 8 times by 1 is also 8. So CD4 cells they respond to MHC2. CD8 cells respond to MHC1. Main thing from there. Now let's go specifically to each one. CD4 cells, they form our T helper cells, and these help to provide signals and activate other cells of the immune system. T helper cells can also enhance activation of the CD8 cells, whereas CD8 cells will form our cytotoxic T cells. Like I mentioned earlier in the summary, cytotoxic T cells, they basically kill infected cells either by cell lysis or they activate the FAS pathway, which would then lead to apoptosis. And that's basically a summary of T lymphocytes. Now let's go to our last one of the lymphoid stem cell, which is our natural killer cells. So natural killer cells, also known as NK cells, these are activated by cytokines, which are released from the macrophages, as well as interferons. Interferons are a specific type of cytokine. Natural killer cells, so what they do is they recognize abnormal cells, for example, like the cells of tumors, and they don't really work with like specific antigen receptors. So natural killer cells will kill cells by releasing cytokines, and that would then cause cell death via apoptosis. I've done a little diagram here. So the macrophages would release your cytokines as well as interferons. Interferons are like a separate category of cytokine. So cytokines and interferons will then activate our natural killer cell, which is this thing here, and that would thus release cytokines, which would cause apoptosis or programmed cell death. Now, natural killer cells also can release interferon gamma. Interferon gamma would then it would further activate your macrophage, which would then release more cytokines, which would then produce activate more natural killer cells. Now, this is kind of a loop of positive feedback, and this would increase your inflammatory response. Now, I've gone through the majority of this, these like different cells and the different pathways. Now I'm going to go towards dendritic cells. Dendritic cells, the reason I've put it here and I haven't really like drawn it to any arrow is because dendritic cells can arise both from this pathway of like the whole myeloid stem cell and also from this pathway of lymphatic stem cells. That's why I've just drawn it at the bottom as like a separate category. So yeah, main thing to know, it can arise from both pathways. Now, dendritic cells, there's different types and they come from different places, like they arise from different places, but they perform similar functions. This is like a general drawing, I think. And important things to know is the role of dendritic cells, which is dendritic cells will take up the antigen, they would process this, and then it would present it on a cell membrane. So let's say, for example, my finger is a pathogen, or sorry, my finger is like, yes, a pathogen, then the dendritic cell would take up the antigen of it, would process it there, and then it would present it on its cell membrane. So dendritic cells have got both MHC type 1 or class 1 and MHC class 2 receptors, and that's on its membrane. And the main thing to know is that dendritic cells act like a postman. So let's say, for example, let me just quickly get a pen. This is someone's arm. That's their abnormally large fingers. Now, let's say this is the site of infection, this thing here. So dendritic cells are in the bloodstream and the lymphatic system, and it would come to the site of inflammation. I think I said infection first time, I meant inflammation. And then it would go back, and basically, like I said, they act as a postman. So they present the antigens on both the CD4 cells and CD8 cells, and they can take it to other parts of the body, and that would thus initiate your adaptive immune response. So that's a very, not quick, I mean, I guess it is quick overview of the different types of cells. I think the next video I need to make should be like about specific